Morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. So my name is Munir Mohammed. I have the privilege and honor of chairing the UK Pre-Gallian Awards panel. When you're organizing an event like this, you always worry about whether people are going to turn up. So I'm so grateful to see so many of you here. Thank you for coming. We've got a great program for you this morning. So thank you to the Pre-Gallian team, Mel Walker, where's Mel? Mel Walker, Asutosh Yagnik, and various other people. I hope he's here. I did see him. So thank you so much for helping us to organize all this. And what a fantastic venue. We've got the Science Museum at now, and then we have the Natural History Museum in the evening. I first visited these museums around here when I was about 11 years old, and since then I've been enthralled by these museums. I was looking at the history of the Science Museum. It opened in 1857 on this site. And one of the first exhibitions in 1862 was Stephenson's rocket. Ever remember learning about that when you were at school? And I was just looking at what exhibitions they have at the moment, and they've got something on food and how we need to change the way we prepare, develop, make sure that we can keep the world fed without destroying the planet. And one of the exhibits there is the first beefsteak which has been grown outside a cow. And I was just thinking about that, and I guess when people go there, they'll probably ask, how good does it taste? Well, I probably answered that it probably depends on the cook. I'm a terrible cook. It'll taste bad, irrespective of where it comes from, I think. But thank you for coming again. As I said, we've got a fantastic program and two brilliant keynotes as well today. We want this to be as interactive as possible. We want you to be able to ask questions. And this is a great opportunity to network, to collaborate, make new friends. And so please do enjoy today. So thank you for coming. And we'll go into the first panel. Mel's there. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Maybe the panelists could come up and sit on the stage, actually, while I open up. So a very warm welcome to this first panel session of Pre-Gallian 2025. For those of you who might be familiar with Pre-Gallian, the awards are sometimes referred to as the Nobel Prize for Life Sciences. So I thought I'd open today with a quote from a Danish physicist. His name was Niels Bohr, and he said, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." And I can certainly vouch for that, because well over a decade ago, I worked for a large pharma at the time, and I was involved in a project where we wanted to submit to a pilot of relative effectiveness assessment. This was a UNETA pilot, and for those of you who might be familiar with the work of UNETA, that was the precursor of what we now see as more formal governance with JCA. And working for a large pharma, those of you who do, you might realize that there's quite a lot of approvals that you have to get through. And so I worked hard to get through all of these approvals to allow us to submit this medicine into this pilot, because it felt a bit risky to the organization, because it was something new. The reason why I went to all of that effort, because I felt that this was going to be something that the organization would be facing in the next 2 to 3 years, and I was making the organization fit for the future. Little did I know it would be 13 years before we finally have JCA now being implemented. I think it was Bill Gates who said we overestimate what may happen in a year and underestimate what may happen in 10 years. In our case, make that 13. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here chairing this panel. My name is Mel Walker. I'm a life sciences advisor and CEO of Access InVivo. My mission is to help innovators, particularly small companies, to think about the global commercial realities of launch and market access and bring those realities back into early clinical development when we can still make the decisions around evidence generation that can radically impact on patient access. And of course, patient access is linked with commercial success. So it's a win-win, a win for patients and a win for companies. So here we are with JCA. We've got a fantastic panel, an all-star panel to cover this topic today. But before I ask the panel to introduce themselves, I'd like to ask the audience a couple of questions. So the first question, and I'd like a show of hands, Who here is their role is involved in HTA submissions, or feel that your role might be affected in any way by HTA decision making? Can I have a show of hands?
Oh.
So hopefully everyone in life sciences put their hands up there. And certainly today it's affecting us all. Second question is, who's heard of JCA and is familiar with JCA? Okay, so a good number, 2. And then who is still working out the implications and what this really means for us? Okay, so, well, you're in the right place, and we're all in the same boat, because there's no data yet. We've only the first couple of products are going through JCA as we speak. So we'll have more data soon, but we're here today to sort of work out what the implications might be. So if I could ask the panel to introduce themselves, maybe start with you, Greg, and then come back in this direction.
Sure, thanks, Mel. My name's Greg Rossi. I run the oncology business for AstraZeneca in Europe and Canada.
So my name is Niklas Hedberg. I'm the chief pharmacist at TLV, and that would be the Swedish equivalent of NICE, more or less. But I also have the honor of being one of 2 co-chairs of the member states coordination group under the HTAR in EU, and I was the chair of UNETA for the last 7 UNETA years.
Great. Hi there, I'm Sam Roberts. I'm the Chief Executive of NICE.
And good morning, everybody. I'm Steffen Thirstrup. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at the European Medicines Agency.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Valentina Strammiello. I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at the European Patients Forum. I'd like to add that I've been involved in HTA for 10 years, but I always feel a newcomer because I'm surrounded by great experts. And I like to feel that there is still more to learn. And so I want to keep that genuine patient perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. So a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Steffen and Sam, for appearing on the pre-Gallien stage for a second time, I believe. So nice to have you back. Anyway, so last year's pre-Gallien, we started the first session was on patient-centric R&D. And there was so much feedback after that session about how wonderful it was to start with the patient perspective, and it wasn't just an add-on or an afterthought at the end. And so we decided this year to ensure that every panel session had a patient voice. And I want to actually start, as we mean to go on, and maybe start with the patient voice for this panel session. So Valentina, I'm going to ask you to sort of take more of a sort of helicopter view now. And what are your sort of views from the patient community on their hopes and aspirations for HTA more broadly, both at the national level, and then think about what your aspirations are for international HTA collaboration as it becomes more integrated and hopefully more effective?
So I think HTA is a great area of work for patients. Still, I feel there is a need to demystify health technology assessment. Patient communities are not always so well aware of the implications. And there is a risk to interpret HTA as a gatekeeper to access to care. I rather would like to perceive it as an enabler of access, as long as it comes with robust evidence generation and assessments. Evidence generation is key to make sure that HTA brings the value that patients need in access to appropriate high-quality care. So my work with the patient community is to explain exactly what it implies, how they can contribute, how it is meaningful to them. And once they do understand that it's strictly related to access, we need to make sure that it's also perceived in a positive manner.
Yeah.
When it comes to integration, of course, I see a great opportunity there, because the more data we are able to gather, collect, and assess, the better the results will be. It's a question of making sure, not just making sure that there is access to care, but making sure that it is appropriate, safe, and effective. So patients not necessarily want to access to care, to whatever care. We need to make sure that the evidence that we collect informs robust decision making.
Yeah.
So sometimes I would even advise that sometimes it's not appropriate to provide access to new therapies that prove not to be that effective or that prove not to be so safe. And so we need to make sure that patients and the larger patient community understand that lack of access is maybe also meaningful for them. Sometimes we also realize that accessible care is obsolete. And for example, in this case, I think it's wiser to make sure that funds, resources are released for more appropriate care in the future. So that's where we see also the opportunity for patients to get involved, to provide their feedback, make sure that their input is fully considered. We need to make sure that they have a say when it comes to research and assessments prioritization, making sure that the knowledge they can bring is really well integrated in the process. It's a long exercise, a long process. We, as patient community, we constantly work to make sure that we are understood, involved, and listened to. Sometimes there is a risk also to perceive the patient communities as the ones who are the troublemaker. And I would like also to demystify these aspects. Patients are there to contribute and make sure that the whole public health system makes the most out of the resources that are available.
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. I appreciate that. Now, Sam, we're on your home turf.
Yeah.
UK has, and NICE is actually probably the most well-respected HTA body around the world. I know that you've been involved in lots of HTA collaborations. NICE International has worked with lots of governments and systems around the world. Can you sort of comment on some of those collaborations, the benefits of those, what's worked well? Maybe touch on patient engagement, because I know NICE do a good job of that too. And then maybe cover how sort of JCA fits into that sort of patchwork of HTA collaboration.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, we've had a strange old time of international collaboration because we were best friends with the EU until we weren't. So we've been a little bit like the kid in the playground who's no longer got their group of friends and has got to go out there and make new friends. Oh, poor us. I know. So it's been really interesting because on the one hand, we stay close to our European neighbours, but we're not part of any of the formal structures. But we've had to go and make new friends. And so the two kind of groups of new friends we've made, one are with Canada and the US, and then the second is through this AusCan NZ initiative, which is through Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and us. So we've been thinking a lot about, you know, when you make new friendships, you've been thinking a lot about what you want to get from the friendship, how much effort to put into the friendship. And I think that there's a couple of, because we're an evidence-based organization, you know, we went to the data. What does the data tell us? And there's been some good recent publications, one by the Office of Health Economics, one by Kumar et al. That's looked actually at international HTA collaborations. Who's most influential, what do they do, etc. And then we've kind of hypothesized some things from them. So it looks like the things that work well are if you're going to be transparent and rigorous and fast. So I think the first two are absolutely baked into JCA, so that's great. That we're going to have another real, you know, massive power player on the block. I think that would be wonderful. The second thing that we've learnt about international collaborations is that running these HTA agencies is brutal business. And so we all kind of get together like a little support group once every 2 months and just share our worries. And it's actually that personal connection, that human connection. We know about each other's kids, we know about each other's lives, we know about each other's politics, that is really important. And I can imagine you folks are spending lots of time together just kind of making the personal connections. So I think that's really important. And then the third thing that's really worked for us is focusing on specific technical areas, because there's a big gulf between really liking each other and actually doing something meaningful together. So we started with small things. So we all thought, if transparency is really important, we can't have heaps of data redacted due to confidentiality reasons. So we worked really hard with ICER and Canada on a joint statement on confidentiality. That worked pretty well. So now we've got a slightly more ambitious project looking at additional non-traditional benefits, so not length and quality of life, but other benefits, so like the ISPOR value flower kind of elements. So those are the three things that have worked well. In terms of patient engagement, I mean, I think we learn a lot from sharing from each other, and that's why we're so excited about the JCAA, is because we don't think HTA is a competitive field. We completely think a rising tide lifts all boats. So every time we collaborate, we learn more than we teach. And I think we're going to learn a huge amount from JCA, both in how it's evolving and then the transparency and rigor that it's going to provide for the international market. I think this is a really exciting time. And we're so pleased to be your, I don't know, not close friends, but hopefully still acquaintances.
Thank you, Sam. So, Steffen, I'd like to come to you next. And obviously, the EMA is playing a role. You've got synchronous assessments now with JCA. How does the regulator see it? How do you sort of see that review process working and those two processes side by side contributing to better patient access? I know the EMA has played a role before in bringing HTAs to the table, and it seems that there's a similar role here.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. First of all, we lost some good friends, and we are now in a similar situation that we have to connect to new friends. But they're not that new anyway, because as you said, we've been involved in the UNETA. I myself was there when it started, but that's another story. So we already had that time to get acquainted to each others. We saw the legislation being drafted, and we knew the drop dead date was in January. So we already started with working with Niklas and the coordination group in establishing the implementing act, establishing how we best possible could work together. We've been very keen on avoiding to establish two pathways, because historically it's been regulation, marketing authorization, and then HTA. The more we could align those two processes and having them run in parallel. So one of the things, just as an example, is we created a common notification for companies. So you don't have to file with us and with Niklas's group. So we have a common document. We validate whether the product is at all reviewable from a regulatory perspective, and then we notify the coordination group that this is actually going to happen. We've been working on a lot of different how technicalities, when can we share what and when does it make sense? Because the idea is, of course, that assessment is going to run in parallel. But all of you in companies who have submitted a marketing authorization, you know that you typically ask for the indication of this length, and you end up getting this, or maybe this over here. So there's no idea in Niklas's group spending time on assessing this indication if in the end you're only getting some of it. So we need to have a preliminary look at the approvability and where this goes, because otherwise we will be wasting a lot of people's time in the coordination group. But on the other hand, we cannot have them sitting on their hands. So it's been a balance, and I'm sure you, Niklas, can speak more to this. We have, as you said up front, very limited experience. 2 products is undergoing. I'm aware, and I think I can say this, we have 6 products now, because I saw yesterday that we sent notifications for the next 2 ones, all of them in oncology, few of them ATMPs as well, but no non-oncology ATMPs as far as I remember. So I think we are establishing this work, and then I think the proof is in eating the pudding,
yes.
as I said. So that's where it comes to. But I think we've done a lot to work to shorten down the time from approval to hopefully HTA assessment. And then, of course, they're going to be the national phase where countries going to decide on reimbursability and so forth.
Yeah. Well, that idea of the preliminary look at the label sounds very sensible, actually, because I knew that was one of the wrinkles that we might come to a bit later. Niklas, I guess you are sort of the most likely to be an expert in this area, leading the HTAC. So could you, picking up, and obviously the common notification, and Steffen's already talked about that, can you just pick up a little bit, give an overview of the mission of JCA and the overall objectives, and then maybe a sort of a light summary of the process, just to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Yes, thank you. And of course, thanks for inviting me. Right now I start wondering why you need me, because everything I was planning to say has already been covered, more or less. There's not much to add, but full agreement might also be a very important sign for the outer world. So for us, I think, we also have, of course, in EU the political messages, the political ambition with introducing the HTAR, of course, from the Commission themselves and further down, trickling down. It's about also evening out the differences between patients in the member states in Europe. And once again, we pity that UK is not among those yet, but you were probably not worst off on that scale either, anyway. And then it must come with quality, effectiveness, and timeliness. So I think those are among the overall and general ambitions. But I think that Valentina caught it very well. So enabling efficient delivery or access is probably what needs to be at the core. And doing that by stimulating and enhancing the best quality of evidence and data. So much of what have been covered here already. And then, of course, we do realize that we have challenges with the huge benefits we have, the tight collaboration with EMA and with the tight connection of the timelines. So we have to work out a number of well, how do you do this? But the ambition is very good and should be a rule of thought for all of us, I think, because we do have mandates that are so close to each other in the long term for the benefits of patients and societies. So I hope we will see those benefits while we constructively and hopefully as much as possible together try to tackle also the technical and practical challenges, because we have those. We realize that. But and then JCA, to give an overview, I saw that about half were very familiar and the rest perhaps not so. An interesting point, I do realize when Steffen is giving you some information that by very good reasons, we have made a difference in the coordination group system. So I actually don't have access to the same information that Steffen has, or that the co-workers at TLV has that are members of the different subgroups. Because I'm only a member of the coordination group, because that's where I am supposed to do my work and contribute. And I am then not in need of, for example, commercially sensitive information that is going into the individual specific JCAs. So I actually don't have all the information even that Steffen has from his side, but on the general level, of course. So what we do is we get the information first, a heads up, and then a validation from EMA. We start already before validation our processes for the PICO, and that's the new unifying. That's not new to HTA bodies, but the new thing is that under the coordination group and under the HTAR now, everyone will work with the PICO, the patient group, the intervention, the comparators, and the outcomes, and try to consolidate a joint EU PICO for each product. And we can talk much about that, what is the optimal number of PICOs for a product. It's larger than one, but not too large. When that has been done, and we have verified that, the JCA process contains a time slot for the companies to work with their HTA dossier, their joint dossier, and then it is the time for the joint European assessment of relative clinical effectiveness, which will come then in very tight connection to the later part of the EMA process. And we might still run into surprises when Steffen talks about those big changes in indication texts, for example. But in general, I think the plan is good, and it's very well thought through how the jigsaw pieces can fit together. So I don't know if that was enough or perhaps too much, but no. In general, those are the different building blocks of the JCA. The PICO process, the company time for the dossier, the HTA agency time for writing up our product, and then the launch process at the end, where we also need to connect to the EMA.
Yeah, thank you, Niklas. And clearly, the sort of the promise and the aspiration is all positive. But you talked about evening out the differences between member states. You know, the devil will be in the detail, but we'll get into that in this next part of the conversation. Greg, last but not least, you know, we've got an industry audience here, majority, and so I know that you're a bit of an optimist, but I'd really be curious of your view on JCA. You know, what do you think is the potential for this to really sort of streamline and improve patient access? I know there'll be some wrinkles you might want to refer to, and we will come to those too.
Yeah, we can get into the details, but I think so. Certainly an optimist, and we have certainly a couple of problems that require some solutions when we think about access in Europe. So I think that this is certainly a very well-intended, well-thought-out framework. Obviously, we're going to see whether it actually solves some of the problems that we have. But if I just back up a little bit, you know, I mean, I unapologetically focus on oncology. I know that the JCA at the moment is focused on oncology as well, but will expand to other technologies as well. But if we just look back at the last 25 years, 30 years in oncology, and I've just come back from ASCO this week. It's quite remarkable what we're seeing in terms of the outcomes that we're getting for patients. You know, when I started out in the industry, the average number of new molecular entities in oncology in Europe was 1 a year. You know, that's sort of in the 1990s. For the last 5 years, it's been 13 as an average per year. And when you look at the number of new indications that come on top of that, it was over 160 that we saw over the last sort of 5 years for oncology. So that's fabulous from a patient point of view, from an innovation point of view, from I think creating differential outcomes for patients. We are light years away from where we were. It's a massive capacity question. The self-help group that I think Sam was talking about is probably also thinking about what's the capacity that we can handle. It's also an evidence challenge that Valentina was talking about. I think, you know, when we talk about the PICOs, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, you know, just the biomarker definitions, the populations, the pre-treatments that patients have had. Are you newly diagnosed? Are you know, pre-treated in the adjuvant setting? If you're in second line, you know, what did you get in the first line? What are the series of subsequent therapies you get? How do you think about crossover analysis? There's a whole range of technical things that mean that the evidence that we have clearly is critical to understand how can we inform decision making, whether that's clinical decision making or whether it's health system decision making. The evidence is getting more complex, it's getting more expensive for us to develop. You know, we have in the adjuvant setting a number of studies now. These are like 1,000 to 2,000 patients. You know, average cost per patient is now getting over 350,000 per patient. That is the cost of those studies. Do the maths on that. You can talk about, you know, sort of somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion for an individual phase 3 clinical trial. How many of those can you do? This is the challenge I think we have. So I think we've got, you know, we're not in the Natural History Museum, we're in the Science Museum, but there's 3 elephants in the room. I think number one is time. You know, the data that we just showed in the plenary session of ASCO, the study, I'm not allowed to talk about it in a public forum because I can't link indication and drug from a compliance point of view, but that study has priority review from the FDA. Patients in the US will basically get access if we're successful with that FDA review. It's probably early next year. It's probably going to be early 2027 for the earliest member state in Europe, and it's probably going to be on average sometime in 2028 that patients are actually getting access 2 years after patients in the US. And this is something that was deemed to be one of the top 5 new studies that are reading out in oncology that we're talking about. So that's a delay that I think we really need to solve. And I know that Nicholas and the whole purpose of JCA is to actually address some of that timing. And I think that's great. Second thing is the actual level of access that we have here in Europe. You know, so if you look at that last 5 years, 40% of the indications that were approved in the US are not available in Europe at all. That's a regulatory question. Some of that's a time dependent, but some of it's that they're just not being submitted over here. And even if they do get EMEA approval, only about 50% of those indications have full access across the entire European Union in terms of the member states. So clearly the equity of access and the consistency of access to what we know works is an area that we need to address. And the third, and probably now increasingly large elephant in the room, is price. We have most favored nation. We have the Trump administration talking about international reference pricing and including the US in international reference pricing. And the differentials in net prices and in list prices between those two regions are substantial, certainly in oncology. And so how do we resolve that question? And my CEO and many of the pharma CEOs have started to talk about the need to basically ensure that we're not free riding on innovation that's funded exclusively or predominantly by US citizens and US patients through their health insurance, and what's the right level for the US and what's the right level for Europe, because Europe has, in large part over that last 20 years, really not had a lot of price inflation on net prices, and it is starting to challenge, I think, some of the equity and issues that we see.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to basically resolve many of those things through JCA, how we do it, but they're not easy problems to resolve. And so I think we're going to need to be working together to work through the initial experience, and then how do we basically use this as a way to change some of those things. We can do a lot at the European level, but what are the member states going to do? Are they going to remove some of the hurdles? Are they going to remove some of the barriers? Are they going to remove some of the duplication that now is going to be done at the European level? If we don't see that, I think this is going to be very challenging.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So there's definitely room for optimism. There's some problems that we need to solve, but it seems like there's some wrinkles to be worked out along the way if it's going to achieve its aspiration. Maybe a quick question to the audience. If I asked you whether you thought JCA was going to be a net positive or a net negative, can I see a show of hands for net positive? A few. Net negative? Yeah, okay. So mixed, but a more optimistic audience. So that's good news today. Anyway, so let's get a bit into the sort of weeds now, into the detail. So I think here I'd like to sort of really think about the potential synergies, but also the potential roadblocks, the points of friction, maybe we can start again with Niklas. Greg, you may raise the point about how much is this going to flow through into the countries and how much of the duplication is actually going to be avoided. Maybe you could comment on that. And then there's also the sort of niggle of the PICOs and how we sort of address those. Do we really get sort of consolidation to a reasonable number? But feel free to address the synergies and the friction points as you see them.
Shall I?
Yes, please. If you could start.
This is a challenging situation, and thank you for bringing up the price, because we had a quite fierce discussion in a European meeting in Berlin a couple of months ago about what is the value of the whole regulation, actually, because it can be read, depending on how you read patient access, it can be read that products must come with financing to all the people of all member states, or the regulation has failed. But there is no financial part. There is no money in it. That's a national remit in the EU. That's up to the member states. So a more valid KPI, if I put it that way, a more valid measure of the success would be, for example, quality of evidence, if we can measure that, but at least then time to the start of national implementing or national negotiation processes in all member states. If we can even out those and shorten those, I think we have already, achieved something very good. Because and things are changing so much in the US now, so we can't even put those into our equations to make sure that we get on the right track for all the expected prices that we will have. But HTA on a joint level is not about pricing, but it must enable price discussions, as Valentina pointed out, in the different member states and our regions. And by all means, in other settings as well. I don't know if NICE will be the biggest reuser of all our products outside of EU, but I'm sure that we will have a number of partners and agencies that are very eager to find a high-quality, timely report written in English, easy for them and available for them, free of cost, almost in any setting in the world. So that's where I think we must try to go. And now I've forgotten your second question.
No, so there was about the PICOs and aligning the PICOs together, how you sort of address that, because I think there was some simulations. There potentially could be a load of PICOs that industry has to address.
And there we will come into joint scientific consultations as well. But I think over time, first, the member states will, and everyone involved in our processes, I include the patient organizations and the clinical associations actually, will learn how to consolidate their views over EU. I think the first year of these discussions, the full responsibility was put on the HTA agencies. And then Valentina made a presentation in the closed meeting, but the stakeholder meeting, that opened the eyes of everyone. You have the same problems. How do you make sure that you, representing a European-based, EU-based patient organization, provide a workable PICO that represents 27 national member patient organizations and all their wills? I mean, wherever we are, we must realize that we are in the same boat. We must recognize that, yes, it is good or it's needed to respect the needs of a broad range of patients, irrespective of where they live. But if it's a very, in EU then, in which country, but if it's a very small or very obsolete group, shall we force that into the PICO with the cost of having too many? So I think, hope that over time, if we look with a 10-year horizon, 13 might be too much, but 10-year horizon, I know that already now the clinical expert organizations are trying to fit in the JCA process in their own processes of writing or editing, updating clinical guidelines on a European level. But, okay, if this comes in as a JCA from the coordination group, then this is probably how we need to take that into account. And if that will influence the European guidelines, we have already started a huge convergence that will be to the benefit of probably everyone. And last thing, a little nudge or a little thorn in this is also, we do this to promote better evidence. And especially the situation, and I'm known for being very frank and very honest also today, so many of the European HTA bodies have heard from the company, this study isn't possible. And when you scratch the surface, the reason is it's not requested by FDA. That's why it's not possible. We realize that there are studies that are not possible and that might get too expensive or too time-consuming, but just the reason FDA won't require it, that's not a reason to say it's impossible. And we hope that together with 450 about million people, we will be a new force that can actually influence the future evidence production.
Thank you, Niklas. So I heard you there, you sort of posed the question that NICE might be a reuser of your products. And actually, I'd like to ask Sam about the practical implications of the JCA process and reports, but also the fact that you've had synchronous assessments for quite some time. Often your decisions are within a few weeks of the regulatory approval. Yeah. So can you sort of comment first on that and any learnings that you might have around how you've achieved that, and then maybe comment on the practical implications of the reports and the process?
Yeah, great. So in England, we do joint things run in parallel, HTA and marketing authorization. So at the moment, how we do it is we're kind of almost two independent processes. We try to schedule them independently, but where there's no kind of incentives or disincentives if the company chooses to not schedule them together. But what we've been looking at over the years is collecting the data to say, what does it look like from a patient point of view if the companies do regulation and HTA together? And there, the average delay between license and NICE approval is about 45 days. And about, I think last year, about 17% of all of our appraisals fell into that category. So that feels right. If I'm a citizen, that's what I'm expecting, right? Somewhere between a month and a half to 3 months. However, and this is the big takeaway for industry, where industry choose to not opt into that process, which is either we don't know that the molecule's coming soon enough, or industry don't have the data ready and ask for a delay, the average time between license and marketing authorization is about 350 days. That's just not right, right? So, and I'm going to kind of really labor this point, if this is okay, because if there's one thing I would want industry to take away from this, is please go and speak to your regulatory and HTA colleagues and figure out a way of submitting together. And to just belabor why it's not right. I mean, obviously it's not right for patients. There are now patients that are waiting 300 days that did not need to. But the second reason is a purely commercial one. In the UK, your voluntary pricing scheme rebate goes from your time of marketing authorization. So you are literally kind of giving away a year of rebate by not coordinating these things. That may be a slightly too technical point. Happy to talk about it further if people are interested. So I think we've kind of taken it as far as we can with the opt-in, and we've only gotten to 17%. So now we're being a little bit tougher this year, and you may have seen in the Chancellor's announcement for growth is that this year NICE and MHRA are putting together a kind of a joint process where there's much more alignment. So there it would be opt-in, but there's information sharing on both operational and technical data. And so that's again, look, the same theme that covers all of these things is we've had to do work there on kind of 3 levels. So the first is the kind of aligning the operational process. And what you probably don't realize is these places are big machines, right? We've got 150 topics going at any one time. And industry asks for maximum flexibility. You cannot have 150 topics in flight across 2 organizations with maximum flexibility. So I think that's the first thing we're going to sort of be saying is, where's the flexibility super valuable for you? We need to keep it. And where do we just have to say, actually, that benefit, those 300 days for patients are worth us being slightly less flexible. So that's the first thing, the conversation with industry. The second is the boring but important. You've got 150 things moving on 2 sides, is the operational data sharing is not straightforward. When are you scheduling CHM? When are you scheduling the committee? Oh, no, industry's asked for delay, all the schedule has to change, blah, blah. So that's the thing kind of the team's been working with most on. And the thing the third element is the technical information sharing. And this is the classic, we haven't quite got the indication right, or hey, presto, the license comes up with a companion diagnostic that wasn't part of the HTA. And that we've realized is less about process and it's just more about people. Is there a way that we can connect the 2 appraisal teams? And I don't know how you folks are going to do this in Europe, where the technical lead of the NICE appraisal team is connected to the technical lead of the licensing team, so they can just pick up the phone to each other within the confidentiality agreement and the industry opt-in, just to say, this is what we're seeing, are we roughly in the right direction? So I think those are if I were working on JCA, those are the 2 things I'd really focus on. 3 things. Industry expectation about flexibility, because otherwise it's not going to get fast. Operational data sharing, technical data sharing. And then for industry, it's not going to get fast unless there's 2 things. Your regulatory and HTA people are ready to submit together, and they are not. So we're doing pipeline meetings with your colleagues, and we just see the regulatory people set the timeline, and HTA folks are like barely even, they're an afterthought, right? So that will have to radically change. And then the second is we'll have to have an honest conversation about flexibility. Can't have it all.
Thank you, Sam. So Niklas also mentioned one of the sort of KPIs should be around the quality of the evidence, and the whole mission was to promote better evidence.
Yeah.
And Greg, I'd like to sort of come to you next, and sort of obviously the company is developing the evidence. It feels like the bar is almost being raised on evidence because there's a lot more evidence that you now need to provide up front. But does that mean that you provide it up front once and then there's less downstream evidence that you have to generate? So do you think it is, from a company perspective, is it potentially streamlining or providing efficiencies or forcing a process that drives up front, or is it raising the evidence bar? And and then the other thing is where are the sort of pitfalls and sort of risks as you see them around the process?
Yeah, and I think it could be both to the answer to the question. Raising the evidence hurdle and streamlining. So I agree with Niklas. I think one of the things about starting to standardize, at least from a HTA evidence point of view, a bunch of disparate, relatively small markets together, so that as a block they have, I think, a more harmonized set of needs, or at least for us to understand what those needs might be, is useful. And I think that we're already seeing that. So just even the term PICO as a conversation that we're having now in our target product profiles, in our phase 3 assessment reviews inside our organization, to be able to use a framework that talks about the population, the intervention, the comparator and the outcome in that type of framework, I think is useful. We also hope that there are complex evidence issues that we've already talked about, some of them. And we see different HTAs, whether you're using IQWiG with GBA and its view around what's a patient-centered outcome versus NICE that allows a modeling outcome in the presence of uncertainty, versus, in Spain, for example, where the therapeutic positioning report may be sort of handled in a more sort of academic and clinical sort of framework. So these things are very different. And so when they're isolated and different, it's very difficult for a global organization to be able to say, let's slow down our phase 3 decision, let's slow down our clinical studies, let's incorporate these elements, because it might be important in Romania or in Czech Republic or in Spain to do that. We're not going to do that. And so that's where I think you start to see some of this. So I think having a centralized place that allows us to have that conversation, and one of the things we might get into is, can we actually have that conversation? So the advice processes and the engagement processes are pretty limited right now for understandable reasons, but that conversation is going to be critical, and I think is an area that we can work on. The PICOs we're worried about, just in terms of just how much volume that we can get. So we hope, we've got a submission to JCA in the coming weeks around that. And actually we've had quite a lot of good engagement around that, although I don't think that's the standard process, but we've had a lot of good engagement. But just on this one study, there's 164 potential PICOs that we could have. So this is first line hormone receptor positive breast cancer. All right, so basically, postmenopausal, premenopausal, newly diagnosed versus prior treated, are you using, abemaciclib, palbociclib, ribociclib, are you using that in combination with letrozole, anastrozole, Faslodex? So this is the reality of trying to sort of do a study in this particular area, and that's before I get into the biomarker subgroups and what might happen. So we've got to have a sensible conversation about, is this 4,000 new analyses? Because that's what the analysis, that's what our calculation is. Is this 4,000 new analysis, and what are you going to do with that? Or can we basically have a conversation to say, simplify, what are the most important things? Do you really need men versus women in this analysis? 2% of metastatic breast cancer are men. Do I really need to basically go and have that conversation around, is this? So these are the conversations that I think we need to get sort of fairly practical around what is helpful to make decisions versus what is just a procedural sort of process, and then what can be left to an individual member state versus what do we need to do to help inform this conversation. So we hope that framework is going to be a useful way to have a conversation about these things, but we do need to have pragmatism around this, and I think we need to have a what I would call a demand side, not a supply side capacity framework. Right. I think if we're saying this is how many we can do because this is how many people we've got, that's going to be a problem. I think we've got to basically say what's the demand and what's the right sizing of that. And then I think, again, back to the member states, we've got to see a removal of duplication. We've got to see a simplification in member states, because that's the only place where these resources are getting allocated, but they're getting allocated in member states. Can we basically have a conversation to say, can I get to 6-month pricing decision in a market? By the way, that's what's the European directive on that? 89/109, that says that all decisions should be made within 6 months of regulatory approval. That pretty much nobody ever achieves. So can we get back to that and say, yes, that's what we want to do. What is it now that you've got JCA that we can start talking about in terms of simplifying IQWiG, simplifying HAS, simplifying therapeutic assessment reports in Spain? This is the conversation I don't hear, at least fully, in every member state, to say, okay, we're actually going to use this to basically accelerate and achieve the outcomes that I think that Niklas well characterised.
Thank you, Greg. I can see why you're worried about the PICOs. That sounds like a bit of a headache to sort of work through all that. I'm going to come to the audience with some questions in a moment, so could we have a microphone ready at the back for that? But Greg just talked about standardising disparate markets, and it sort of occurred to me, Steffen, that the regulators have trodden this path before, 2.5 decades ago, and some people didn't think it was possible around the HTA piece. But can you sort of comment on the challenges that the regulators face with sort of aligning those disparate views? And I know it's before your time at the agency, but then what are the learnings from that for what we're doing now with JCAs?
Well, yeah. We are celebrating our 30 years anniversary this year. So, centralized procedure established 30 years ago.
Well,
that also means establishing the decentralized and the mutual recognition procedure. And I worked in the national authority at that time, so I can speak to that perspective. I don't think we spent all 30 years getting close together. We most likely spent less, but we spent some years up front creating trust in mutual decisions. I worked in the Danish agency. Could we trust an assessment from the Swedish authority? It took a while actually to realize that we were thinking in the same way. And the centralized procedure, of course, added to this that we started creating scientific regulatory guidelines together. So there we got the aligned thinking. I think that's been important. And then you suddenly meet people. You start work together in CHMP, in PRAC, in the CMDH, CMDV, like you're now starting working in the coordination group. So I think that also brings people together, and suddenly you realize that our thinking is maybe not that different. And Danes can trust Swedes and vice versa, of course. We may have problem with other Europeans, but that's another story. None forgotten here. And building that trust, and also learning that you can utilize the benefit of being a big group that thinks in the same way.
Yeah.
But we will still have to acknowledge that Europe is not the United States of Europe. We are a political union, and that means that there are still 27 member states who at some level want to have their say. And of course, what we are doing now, we've done that on the medicine, on the regulatory side, is doing now on the HTA side, is an approximation of the member states and their thinking.
Yeah.
So it is a more centralized approach, and there will be political dispute about whether that's the right or the wrong thing to do. Personally, I believe it's the right thing to do because it will ultimately be for the benefit of the majority of patients across Europe. So I think we got many learnings there, and I think we already shipped that into the process we have established with the coordination group, talking about common challenges, not necessarily about the PICOs, but also more methodological issues, how to deal with uncertainties. All products come with a level of uncertainties, some with more. Oncology is a good area. ATMPs, gene therapy, what happens 20, 25, 30 years down the line of these products. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this as regulators? How do HTA and even more payers gonna deal with this? Having that discussion from a methodological point of view, I think we already opened that discussion and having a fruitful conversation there.
Yeah, and I guess the HTAs will be making friends for over a decade through UNETA already. So maybe there's a bit of
I think UNETA was a good start of bringing us all together, and also having the regulators around the table. So that's been a good start on it. Maybe, Mel, before we go on, for those of you who did not raise the hand when Mel asked you whether you knew what JCA was or not, that means joint between the member states. EMA is not part of that joint. If we are in that boat, it's parallel joint.
Yes.
So just to get the notion right. And for the oncology, I think it's important, 60% of all new products getting a marketing authorization or getting a marketing authorization review in Europe is in the oncology field. So it's our biggest business, if I may use that term, as a regulatory authority. So over to you.
Perfect sense. Thanks, Steffen. So Valentina, Niklas also talked about the sort of way that patient organisations had to sort of contribute to the evolution of the PICOs. I know you did some simulation work to try and look at how difficult this would be. So could you just comment a bit on how patient engagement is evolving with the JCA and how that will work?
Sure. I'd like to bring also a bit the rationale to explain why we decided to run this exercise. We have identified some issues in terms of patient engagement in JCA and in the PICO definition. The first one is, of course, timelines. And they matter to patient organizations as well, because we are asked to help with the identification of the appropriate profiles that will contribute to JCA. Then we identified another major risk that also Niklas mentioned, which is the fragmentation. Of course, if each member state has an opportunity to involve patient organizations on the national level to define a PICO, if there is no coordination among patient organizations for the same disease area, there is a high risk of fragmentation, because they may all come with different inputs and perspectives. And this also depends very much on the different standards of care, of course. Another risk we have identified is the tokenism, because of course we very much welcome the opportunity for individual patients to be invited to interviews or to respond to questionnaires when it comes to a JCA process. But we feel that one patient is not enough. Maybe we need to bring more diverse perspectives. Even though patients often come with similar issues, but still we need to acknowledge that there might be a range of aspects that need to be addressed as well when it comes to different standards of care. And the last point is another big elephant in the room for us, which is conflict of interest, of course. Identifying an appropriate profile that is free from conflict of interest is extremely difficult. Because patients who come with more expertise usually are also the ones who engage in conversations with all stakeholders. That's how you build knowledge, usually. And because of all of these aspects, we thought, together with one of our members, EAMDA, which is the organization representing patients with the neuromuscular diseases, and a research company, Open Health, we have decided to build this consensus building exercise to see whether there would be an opportunity to reduce the fragmentation of the PICO, whether there would be an opportunity to build consensus among patients. We were able to invite to this exercise 12 patients, one per member state. We were not able yet to bring 27 of them, but at least 12 is already a good number if you compare to one patient to be invited to a JCA. And each of them were representing one specific community from a specific member state. We also try to keep a good diversification from a geographical point of view. So we have the patients from Central and Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, from Western Europe, also to make sure that the different standards of care would be considered in this exercise. So the result in the end is that despite all of these diversities, we were able to reach a quite good level of consensus among patients. And that's a signal also for the member states that sometimes those differences that they somehow are claimed as the reason why you need to keep at national level are not that important in the end from a patient perspective. Another point is also in terms of timelines. We feel that this type of consensus building should be run earlier than a JCA. It could also inform a joint scientific consultations. And basically, the information about the relevant patient population, comparator, and outcomes, these are aspects that could be addressed earlier in the process. And I think there is also quite a consensus on this point as well, that you don't need to wait for the JCA to start to run this exercise. The only point that still needs to be addressed is who's in charge for this. Because, of course, as EPF, we were able to take a responsibility. We could count on some public funding from the European Commission to run this exercise. Open Health put a lot of in-kind contribution to make it happen. But in the future, we need to see who's the most appropriate entity to be responsible and accountable for this work. It could be companies, it could be the coordination group or the European Commission. We don't know yet, but for sure we feel that the way forward is not just individual patient involvement, it's rather bringing more robust evidence earlier in the process. And this would be also be much less stressful for patients, because believe me, we have been invited to contribute in the identification of the first patients for the JCAs, and we have received so many questions, and we are not able to respond to all of them, because still there is a bit of uncertainty, and we acknowledge that we are still in a transition phase, so it's not a complaint at all. We know that we are all learning from the process, but we want to make sure that maybe the patient involvement can be revolutionized, can be really improved and made more meaningful. Otherwise, one patient invited to a JCA representing the whole patient community in Europe is a risk, in my view. We need to bring diverse perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. So diversity of patient perspectives and start early is
early, always as early as possible. Of course, and there is no reason why it shouldn't happen. You don't need to wait for a JCA to start. And last point I wanted to make is confidentiality. This also represents a risk. We perceive that there is a different interpretation of what it means from different points of view, and so we would really welcome the coordination group together with the European Commission and health technology developers to meet and agree on what information is really confidential, how confidential is confidential. Otherwise, if you see it from a public perspective, it's a bit hypocritical that the information that is considered confidential, then it's released maybe in some social media or even presented in public events, while you know that the very same information is considered confidential in other settings.
Yeah, understood. And I think Sam was mentioning that they a big effort on that. So I'd really like to come to the audience now for questions. Can we bring a microphone down here? Trevor, you have a question for Trevor? And then Carol over the back there, please.
Thank you very much, Trevor Jones. This is directed at Steffen. Obviously, the industry applauds the incredible amount of work that both the regulatory agencies and the HTA authorities like EMA and so on doing to minimise the time between the two. Otherwise, it was a review by EMA and so on. But isn't it true, and can you assure us, that in terms of the regulatory agency, you're looking at quality, safety and efficacy, and price is not something that influences your decision? Can you assure us of that?
I can reassure that, and I got plenty of slides when I teach students as well. I think as far as I go, I have a balloon with the price tag out of the window, because we cannot ignore the price as individuals. But that decision-making at the European Medicines Agency is about benefit risk based on quality, efficacy and safety. We don't bother about the price. And I don't even think Niklas is going to bother about price, because that's in the end the member states who are going to apply our availability, our access with the availability of HTA to the accessibility on a national level. Yeah.
That's totally correct. For good and bad in the JCA, I must say, but price is not an issue. It's relative effectiveness, relative safety and uncertainty.
Perfect. Janet, because you have the microphone, and then we'll go to Carol. We get a microphone.
Thank you, Janet Woodcock. I'm ex-FDA, so bringing a kind of state's perspective to this. I have 2 comments. First of all, with regard to the patient focus, I was on the board for a long time, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI in the United States. Congress gave a lot of money to them, okay? And they do studies and so forth. But what they have perfected is the science of patient engagement. And I think the lesson for everyone, which is problematic really, it costs a lot of time and energy to do it right, okay? And yeah, you can't have some token patient at the end of the day saying something. That's not how this works. So I feel that really we need more scholarly funding for understanding how to do this. We need more resources directed towards it. Patients alone, I mean, in the States or internationally, okay, patient groups are doing this because nobody else does it. But you really need you need money, you need organization, and then you can get all the patients together and you can do the kind of things that you're talking about. But it's only the larger patient groups are able to do this right now because nobody funds this, because nobody thought this was important before or whatever reason. The second thing I wanted to say is, Sam, what you talked about in harmonization is so eerily reminiscent of what we went through with ICH. Right. ICH, for those of you, it's the International Conference on Harmonization of the Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals, been going on for 30 years. When we started, the people didn't even know each other, the regulators in the different regions, and there was all these problems. But over time, the way it has been done, excuse me, is to work together to develop standards. And so ICH issues guidelines, okay, technical guidelines. And those have 2 purposes. One, they disseminate a standard to everyone, but they force people from the different regions, and of course with ICH also the industry, to work together to a common cause. But one lesson, I think, from ICH is that it requires some staffing and organization. You can't just have people who have a full-time job doing something else, getting that done. And if I may, one more point on this. Okay, so we're starting on international harmonization of regulatory review, or assessment, as you call it here. And to me, that's the holy grail that we need to move forward. We're starting with pharmaceutical quality because it's less, hair on fire, okay? And it's a tremendous burden on the industry to have to submit to 50, 100 different regulators every time they want to make a manufacturing change, which means that there's no innovation in manufacturing, hardly, after approval, which is a horrible situation and adds the cost of goods sold, okay? So ICMRA, the International
Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities.
Yeah, International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities. Excellent. ICMRA has opined on this, has done a pilot with between U.S. and other parties in joint assessment, and ICH is trying to work on a platform for doing that, so that the data would reside in the cloud in one place. And you all suffer the same thing. I mean, all these submissions to all these different groups and all these different standards. Yeah. So I think there are tremendous opportunities to both develop standards, use the cloud or something else rather than all these different, whether you have discs and drawers or whatever you're doing now, right? Everybody's doing something different. But ICH has come a long way and has really, over the years, people got comfortable working together. They respect each other. They have set up different ways of brainstorming. But I think issuing some guidelines or working on technical guidelines would probably be a helpful way to go, because it's less threatening than many other activities.
Thank you, Janet. And so, science of patient engagement, harmonisation, regulatory review. Anyone like to comment on Steffen?
I completely agree what you say, Janet, and I think ICH is a good example. Yeah. They succeeded in quality, non-clinical, but not so much in clinical. I think there's an anti-hypertensive guideline, and that's more or less all
that pathetic.
Yeah, but maybe that's where again you see the difference in how we across the globe regard different diseases and treat different diseases, and that may be the challenge for our HTA folks running into this diversity when it comes to how we do things, and all the 100 and I don't remember 4,000 different picos that you were talking about in breast cancer. But I agree with you, the more we can do to collaborate globally, the easier it becomes, both for regulators, but definitely also for industry, because then we require the same standards.
And for the HTAs as well. And at the end of the day, for the patients, we're going to talk about that on the next panel. For rare diseases, it's a nightmare. You can't have different authorities requiring different studies in different regions when you only have 10 patients.
For the rare diseases, it become even bigger problem, because the low-hanging fruits in terms of frequent rare diseases, that's done.
Right.
Now we are into the ultra rare and even more where you can only do, if you're lucky, one global study.
You got one shot.
Well, so that's for the next panel session. So we'll cover that there. Valentina, would you like to comment on this? And then Carol, I know we have a question back there. Do you have a microphone? Okay.
So just to comment on this nice definition of science of patient engagement, I think I will steal it. And it's true that there is not enough investment yet. We have great examples from some member states of how the way they engage with patients. NICE has set the standards, and I feel we are a bit orphan in this sense because of missing NICE expertise in the European Union. From this point of view, is a big loss. EMA, of course, you also have great experience that we can learn from. But all in all, I feel there is a need for investment of resources. And my hope is that also patient engagement in JCA, in joint scientific consultations, will promote more patient engagement also on the national level. I hope that in the long run, this will lead to more investment also at national level. There is a lot to be learned, and we are aware some member states are beginners in this sense, and they need to of course, scale up their capacity.
Thank you. Carol.
Longson, independent advisor in HTA market access. As many of the panel members will know, this is a topic that's very dear to my heart, having been involved in it for many years. And I just want to thank you for your honesty in explaining some of the challenges. One of the things you said, Niklas, is that let time run its course. These things are absolutely clocked as issues, and it's going to be solved. But I think the problem is this is real. It's a real assessment of a real drug leading to consequences. And so that time issue of just letting processes play out, it's a bit tricky. So I'm wondering whether or not there is a way of being able to think, well, what do we need to do right now? What's the list of priorities where if we do this, we can feel a little bit more confident that this process isn't going to fail. So it's taking the must not fail mentality to derive a priority list of things that need to be sorted out now, collectively, with the regulators and the JCA people, with the JCA people and the stakeholders, and to work through that list. Because the problem becomes that there's so many things that need to be sorted out. It just, time just ticks, and that's what we haven't got with this process, because it absolutely must not fail. It's a really important thing that must succeed and must be seen to succeed as quickly as possible. So maybe this prioritized list with a must not fail mentality allows you to demonstrate to the outside world that you've clocked the key issues. There's a plan to work on them.
Thanks. I haven't used the term must not fail mentality before, but I've noted it down and see if we can use that. I guess.
So, see, otherwise you're going to have other people tell you that. You're going to have your politicians. That's.
What we experience now is that, and Sam, you talked about flexibility. We've been struggling all over the build-up phase with the huge demand on predictability. especially from the developers. It must be predictable down to nuts and bolts. But when it's fully predictable, it's not flexible at all. Those are parts of the same bread. And right now, we are handling a number of very delicate discussions that only revealed when it was for real, when it was, sharp. So I hear you, but I also think we must be allowed to build the new system together with all the stakeholders that are involved, because there are things that could not have been predicted and that couldn't have been described in a very predictable way. And I also must comment on your, to manage the expectations, because also we flip into this equation the new kind of pharma development, can I say that? The new world, where the products and the situation become more and more complex. If you say that you have, a thought of 168 picos, 4,000 analyses.
We're not going to submit 168.
No.
We're going to chance our arm with a few less.
Course, I mean, that's troubling and that's mind-blowing. But my return question, would that have been less without HTAR when you have had to go to all 27 agencies independently? Because if you say, yes, it increases because of introducing the JCA and the new regulation, that's a problem. But if you say, no, this increases because this new nature of the pharma and of the pharma development, and given the 27 settings, we would have had 5,000 without the coordination group, then it's still a success.
Greg, can you comment on that? And then we'll
sure.
go to another question here.
Sure, I think a couple of comments. So firstly, specific to Niklas, what we are planning to submit is broadly similar to what the capacity we would have had to develop for the range of different HTAs, and particularly IQWiG, which are probably the most onerous set of additional analysis that we have to sort of do. So we're trying to sort of use that as a benchmark to say that's the type of thing that we should be submitting. We think that's substantial evidence and that should be appropriate for decision making. Of course, there's only a couple of interactions during that process. It's a fairly prescribed process, so we hope that there's going to be the pragmatism and conversations that we're able to have during that process. But I think this will be, as you say, a test on both sides to be able to say, is it working? And if it isn't working, then what are the key things that we need to change? I love Janet's comment about the ICH and the standardization and harmonization of methodological sort of approaches and standards, because I think that is one of the key issues that we face in terms of individual member states and processes, and therefore how much time, effort and energy do we spend on each of them. And I think that's going to be useful. I'm also old enough to remember when centralized procedure and mutual recognition and decentralized procedure all came in. And I think there was a period of time that the mutual recognition was happening in parallel, that then became sort of decentralized, and centralized became a more adopted framework for the vast majority of new innovative products. So I'm expecting and hoping that that process happens here. Maybe it can happen a bit faster because we've got a template from where the regulators were to say this is what's going to be efficient and effective and helpful for the industry. Because I think we're all in the same place, that we all want to basically develop the substantial evidence to be able to inform decision making. I would like to separate out uncertainty from perception of value, which I think you're doing, because I think oftentimes we see those two things conflated, particularly in systems where they're trying to negotiate a price as an integrated part of the assessment. So, somebody else's uncertainty is somebody else's lack of value. And I think that that's a conversation that if we can separate that and say, is the clinical evidence, do we have confidence in the clinical evidence? Is there uncertainty? Can that uncertainty be resolved? How might we resolve it? What are the methods that can be used for it? Then we can then inform, okay, what's the right, maybe conditional pricing versus final pricing? What is it we can do? Because in that context, we can put some creative proposals on the table. But I think if it's like, we don't think your drug has value, but somebody else says we think it has substantial value, and I've got international reference pricing, I've got parallel trade, I've got a bunch of other things, that creates a challenging sort of situation for us in terms of being able to, I think, have a positive, constructive conversation about can we achieve access? Can we achieve access now? Can we achieve access at some point in the future if we supply additional evidence? Is that coverage with evidence development? Is that evidence development before coverage? I think these are conversations we want to get into.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. We've raced through the time for this panel. There's so many questions that I'd love to answer, but a last question from Tony, because I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I'm Tony Wood. Hi, everyone. I'm head of R&D at GSK. And so first of all, congratulations on a great start. We could probably spend a day talking about 15 of the topics that have been mentioned. One of the challenges I have as a head of R&D is the integration across all of this. What I can know, when I can know it, and how precise we can be about it. And a lot of the challenges we've been talking about are rooted in that fundamental question. I want to bring in something that Janet mentioned, though, because what we haven't talked about in any of this is how we use patient data to inform the proposition to a greater extent across the entirety of the life cycle. So I'm curious about how you see that, not just the patient voice, but the access to real-world evidence and everything that comes with that. I was going to start by saying, Sam, Steffen, I was going to ask you first to give you a chance to think about it, but I didn't do that, so perhaps we might go there. Patient data as a reconciliation of the problems that we've been talking about.
Do you want to go first?
I can go
and
first.
Then I'll go second.
Well, as you know, the European agency, we are very keen on establishing the value of real-world data to real-world evidence, that transition, and going beyond. Some would criticize a real-world evidence that's just pharmacoepi. That's old wine in new bottles, or maybe just old wine with a new label on. You don't know. But anyway, we want to go beyond and say, can we use real-world evidence beyond pharmacoepi, also on the efficacy side? And we have great hopes in the European health data space that it will enable us, both on pharmacoepi to real-time pharmacovigilance, but also to establish efficacy data, to establish real-world data on as a historical control, as a synthetic control arm in uncontrolled studies. And of course, that will take time to get into regulatory acceptability and into HTA acceptability, these kind of things. But I think that's where the discussion is now around how can we use real-world evidence, real-world data. Well, for the patient engagement and patient data, we are very keen on going beyond the patient-reported outcome and talk about patient experience data. So a little bit more, you don't have the assessment by a researcher to qualify the patient-reported outcome, but you get the raw information, whatever you call it. And we are hoping to release a draft reflection paper on patient experience data sometimes after summer.
I mean, we've used real-world data in the HTA space. I mean, I remember 25 years ago, I was pulling real-world evidence for NICE submissions. So, Sam, maybe you can comment on this.
You didn't call it that time.
Yeah, so I mean, we think this is absolutely essential because exactly what you're saying is the only way you can kind of buy or find certainty is by additional data collection. So, I mean, there's a couple of things that we've learned. One is you need to have a proper real-world evidence framework. So we did a lot of work on that 2 years ago, tried to harmonize it with the work in the US, Canada, etc. On what's acceptable, provenance, analysis, etc., etc. So that was the technical work. And when we'd done it and published it, we thought, oh, tech done, did a big international webinar, thought that we were done. But actually, you then in HTA committees are dealing with humans who don't like uncertainty. And I'm seeing the wonderful Jane, who used to chair one of our committees. Then it was a big job for the technical team who developed the real-world evidence studies to sit in with committees and go, well, how about this? How about that? Have you considered this? This is where it's acceptable. And I think now, 2 to 3 years later, we did the stats, and about 60% of our HTAs use real-world evidence, including in primary endpoints. It's not just, kind of population demographics. And we've started using the SAC data, which for those who are not local, That's the oncology data set. And once committees get a taste of that, they love it. Our committees are asking for SAC data all the time now. So I suppose that would be the only thing I'd say with real-world data. Yes, it's great, got to have a clear framework on how to use it, but then you've got to get the humans in the loop comfortable with it.
Thank you, Sam.
The other
sorry, I'm getting the traditional sign from the back of the room, which means that I've run on. But can I just do one quick closing round? Maybe each of you could just give me one hope for HTA collaboration and JCA over the next 5 years, and then one risk or barrier that you don't think is getting enough attention today, but really quick fire. Maybe I'll start with you, Greg, and come back this way.
Well, I think we talked about it a lot. I think this harmonization, standardization, and acceleration of the evidence review is the clear hope. The risk is that we don't see member states change, and that we see that this is an added hurdle, and what we're doing is duplicating and adding yet more sort of cost, effort, energy, and it's not actually informing the outcome that we're interested in, which is efficiency, predictability, speed of access.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I agree. But my hope then is that in let's say 10 years, we will have a system where we have come much closer, where we haven't come down to 1 pico, but definitely less than 168. Also in light of the new pharma development. And we have been able to co-share resources and work more efficiently to be able to keep up with the increasing demands. And we have also solved the challenge with the enabling. We have come to a product that's wanted both by the developers and the actual buyers, because it makes their life better, because they ultimately have to make up also including the price issue. And a challenge is that we must do this right, but we cannot only focus on doing it right. We must have the primarily focus on doing the right things. And flexibility. We need to afford ourselves to learn during the way and be better as we go.
Thank you, Niklas. Sam?
Yeah, so hope, alignment on evidence standards, outcomes, use of intermediate endpoints. I think this is really exciting, and so we're looking forward to learning from it. Fear, well, first of all, I think we need to give Greg a bit of a clap, not now, at the end, for not mentioning most favoured nation pricing, the whole panel. That is restraint, and I think that's the fear. There's just no point in doing regulatory JCA, and then we all get caught up in the confidential reimbursement kerfuffle, which is a subset of nations that are not JCA. So I think we've got to get on our trolley that group of countries that are going to maybe in the basket of figuring out how we're going to deal with that.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Steffen?
I'm European, so I trust in better collaboration and alignment across Europe, but also, to Janice's point, globally, so we can make this work globally. I could be concerned, as said before, about member states, to what extent they will move out of their comfort zone, start thinking out of the box and thinking about also new pricing models and new payment models. That could be the ultimate hindrance of patient access.
Thank you. Valentina, we started with the patient and now we'll close with the patient. Your view.
So I would say my hope is in reuse and uptake of JCA reports. I mean, this is the main reason why we started working on this effort. And we have all invested quite a lot of time and capacity to make it happen. So here we are now. So my biggest hope is that it shows its value. And the risk I see is a lack of resources, and not only for patient organizations, but I think there is a need for higher investment of resources for all others involved in this effort, HTA bodies, European Commission, and everyone that's involved needs capacity, financial capacity to make it happen and to invest what's required to make it happen and to make it a success. I think right now, as we are all very much committed, we are going beyond, and we are really investing a lot of our personal time and capacity to make it a successful experience. But in the long run, I'm not sure this will be the case. We needed to show success to keep it on going. And I think here on this panel everybody is very much motivated, but I can say for me it has been a team building exercise over the years. I don't know how many panels I have joined with Steffen, Niklas, many of them, and every time we could advance a bit more and come to an alignment on what is required, what our perspectives are, how we can join forces. We need to keep going.
Thank you, Valentina. So with that, I'd like to say a big thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the Galleon Foundation for hosting this. And thank you to the audience for the questions and being engaged. So I think we're going to coffee break now, so thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mel.
Thank you.